My name is Michael Conley, and I am the Director of Finance and Operations of the North Reading Public Schools. And today I thought we would look at the Chapter 70 program and talk a little bit about how the Chapter 70 formula works and what that means for North Reading. The governor has released their FY18 preliminary Chapter 70 data. Then I thought we'd talk a little bit about the school budget process and the key upcoming dates. That process in North Reading is going to heat up over the next several weeks. And then as a reminder, I would refresh everyone's memory how they can access some key budget information on our district website. So when you look at the Chapter 70 program, one of the things I think you have to understand is there's three major steps in calculating out that Chapter 70 aid and that process. And the first of that is looking at the foundation budget. And that is calculated, essentially what that does is it represents the minimum spending level needed to provide an adequate education. So step one in the process is determining each district's foundation budget. Each year, the foundation budget is calculated to reflect changes in a district's enrollment, changes in certain student demographic data like student grade level data, low income status, how many students are eligible for would be considered low income status, how many students are English language proficient. So those are a few certainly characteristics in demographic data that goes into the calculation. The other major factor is the inflation factor. So each year the DOR, Department of Revenue, publishes an inflationary factor. And I would say the two main factors in the calculation of the foundation budget would be considered a district's foundation enrollment as well as the inflation factor. And those are the two biggest drivers that calculate a district's foundation budget. Step two would be the calculation of a district's required district contribution. And that's essentially what that is trying to do is determine what a community can afford. That is known as the required district contribution. This represents the amount of local appropriations needed to meet our required net school spending. And certainly there are many variables that go into that equation, but certainly a community's median income level, real estate property values are all major factors that drive that calculation. Step three is then you would then determine the amount of Chapter 70 aid. And this represents the amount of state aid to finance the state share of the foundation budget. It's generally composed of a couple of different numbers either referred to as foundation aid and or minimum aid. And then essentially the sum of the local contribution plus the required district plus Chapter 70 aid plus the required district contribution actually equals what is known as the required net school spending. So over the last couple of years in the case of North Reading, the required district contribution calculation has been a little over $19.5 million. Chapter 78 has been about $6.9 million. So our required net school spending is a little over $26.5 million. That is the amount that we're required to spend. That amount must be equal to or greater than the foundation budget. So you can see in North Reading, that amount exceeds the foundation budget by about $3 million in both fiscal years 17 and 18. And you may ask why we that far above the amount that the state has determined our foundation budget to be to provide an adequate and equal and fair education. And to understand that is you have to look at where North Reading is in a sense of what our target aid amount is. So our target aid share is that 17.5% number right here, which is a minimum target aid amount. So North Reading, in the eyes of the Chapter 70 program and the formula, we are considered a very relatively affluent community, and if everything was perfect in functioning as the Chapter 70 program would want it to be, we would receive 17.5% of our foundation budget. But when you look at the line below that, North Reading is actually receiving far greater than that 17.5%. We're receiving about 10.5 to 11% more than that at 29.35 and 29.27. So we are, in the eyes of the formula, getting more Chapter 70 as a percent of foundation than we should, which is the reason why our required net school spending, the amount we are required to spend, exceeds our foundation budget by that great of an amount, by about $3 million. So it's a little bit about the program. That factor, and that the fact that we are that far above our target aid, I think, is really the predominant reason why over the last few years North Reading has defaulted to only receive the minimum aid amount. So you can see in the case of fiscal 18, where the governor rolled out a minimum amount of $20 per pupil. So North Reading, because in the eyes of the formula we're receiving more aid than we should, kind of defaulted to $20 per pupil times the foundation enrollment of 2,426 to equal a net increase of $48,520 in Chapter 70. So we don't qualify for any what they would refer to as foundation aid or base aid because of where we are in respects to the formula and where our Chapter 70 as a percent of foundation falls. If you look at this kind of a Chapter 70 district profile, I think this is an interesting graph that kind of speaks to a lot of what's been going on in North Reading since the beginning of the Chapter 70 program with the Educational Reform Act in 1993. The blue and white striped bar graph represents our foundation budget amount. So you can see our foundation budget amount has increased for several years, and then they kind of had a decline, and now it's just been staying relatively stagnant since about fiscal year 2011 or so. Not changing significantly. And then you can see the orange bar graph represents the amount of Chapter 70 aid we're receiving. So as you can see, we relatively receive a very small percent of our foundation budget in terms of Chapter 70 aid. So we're about here. That amount's been pretty consistent over the last several years. It's gone up only slightly in small increments. So we do receive a small percent of amount of our foundation budget. The dotted line here represents the required net school spending. So again, this is the amount we're required to spend. And as you can see, over the last several years, because of that, the fact that we're receiving more Chapter 70 aid than the formula thinks we should, the difference between our target of 17.5% and where we actually fall at 29.3% or so is the reason why our required net school spending is so much greater than the foundation budget. And then the solid blue line is our actual net school spending, which, as you can see, we have been spending over the last several years more than what we're required to spend. And you may ask, why is that? And I will just say that's a very common statistic throughout the state of Massachusetts. Most communities do spend more than they are required to spend. The state average is about 18.5 to 19% of districts spending more than what they're required. So most districts spend between 8.5 and 19%. That's this delta here between the solid line and the dotted line, more than they're required to do so. And North Reading is very close to that at about 19.5% more than what we're required to spend. So we're about the state average in terms of that respect. Just very quickly, when you look at some Chapter 70 local comparisons, I thought it'd be interesting if we just spent a minute focusing on where some local area communities that border North Reading are in terms of their target and how that impacts their Chapter 70 aid. So if you look at the far left bar graph, the one that is entitled Target Aid Share, there are 5 communities that I've charted on this line graph. That's North Reading, Wakefield, Reading, Lynnfield, and Stoneham. As you can see, all of these communities since about fiscal 15 or so have been considered minimum aid share communities, meaning that they're all at 17.5%. So we're all considered, in the eyes of the Chapter 70 program, relatively affluent communities with high property values, high median incomes, and they look at us as being our target share at the minimum of 17.5% of our Chapter 78 as a percent of our foundation. So when you look at who's kind of above, or who's the distance from that target age share, moving over to the right to this line graph, and you can see the community out of these 5 communities that has the greatest distance from their target of 17.5%. The target would represent this line here, is actually North Reading. So North Reading is the blue line, the solid blue line, and you can see we're about 11 or so percent away from our target of 17.5%. So I showed you on the first slide that we are about 29 or so percent, and our target is 17.5. So we are the furthest distance away. So if you look at Wakefield and Stoneham, for example, the green and the purple, they are very close to their target or slightly below. So they're getting slightly below their 17.5%, but very close to their target. And then Linfield is pretty close to their target, maybe 1% or 2% greater. And then Reading is also relatively far away from their target, about 8 or 9% above their target. So when you look at, how does this impact Chapter 70 aid, I think it does when there is a major change in a community. For example, most of these communities, when you look at the full day kindergarten program, communities that are at or close to near their target, if they do move from offering a tuition-based full day kindergarten program to a free full day kindergarten program, those that are close to their target age share would stand to benefit by that change that much of a drastic change in offering free universal full day kindergarten. And that's something that Wakefield, Stoneham, and Linfield have done over the last couple of years. The situation in North Reading is similar to that in Reading, in a sense that we are 2 communities that don't stand to benefit from additional aid by a significant change like that in the Chapter 70 program, because in the eyes of the formula, we're already receiving that much more aid than we should by being this far above our target. So that doesn't compute to any additional foundation or down payment aid. We would default to the minimum amount of aid that I spoke of earlier. So it's certainly to understand how these changes work and what the impact is, and to understand why the Chapter 70 program is not a one size fits all. I think you have to understand a little bit about where communities are in relation to what their target age share is. I think that's a very significant variable that sometimes gets overlooked or is easily misunderstood. So then when you look at the bottom 2 line graphs, if you look at the far left, Chapter 70 aid, you can see most communities, Reading's getting the largest amount of aid, close to $10 million. I think that's mostly contributed to the fact that they have the largest enrollment out of these 5 communities. North Reading is about $6.9 million, which is the next largest amount. And Wakefield, Linfield, and Stoneham are all huddling around that $5 million amount, slightly under or slightly above. Now, when you move over to the right, North Reading, as you can see, is due to receives the highest amount of pure pupil of Chapter 78 when you look at it from a pure per student or per pupil basis. And I think that can be predominantly contributed to the fact that North Reading is that far above their target age share. So you can see these 2 charts look very similar. And that's because North Reading receiving that much greater aid than its target is also computing to that receiving that much more Chapter 70 aid on a pure pupil basis. So I hope that kind of helps. I know that's give you a little bit of background on how Chapter 70 program works. It certainly is a complicated formula or a complicated process that has a lot of variables, and it's very difficult to understand even from myself, who's been working with the formula for almost a decade. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of background into the Chapter 70 program. Before I end today, I just wanted to highlight some key upcoming dates in the FY18 budget process. We're due to present our preliminary budget on March 6th. The public hearing of the budget will take place on April 10th. Presentation to the Finance Committee on April 26th. School Committee budget vote on May 1st. Annual town meeting on June 5th. And then some ways to access the budget. Again, if you go to the district website, you find that link to budget under the district website. You can kind of follow along, and all this presentations and preliminary budget information and documents throughout the process are uploaded. The 5-year capital plan is there. The district budget calendar is there. And you can also follow updates I make on Twitter by following at NRPS Finance on Twitter, and any key information and updates along the way are posted. So I hope this information has been helpful to you, and I hope to see you in the near future at some of the upcoming budget meetings. Great. Thank you.